Often compared to the Holocaust, in 1937, Nanjing, China's capital, was hell on earth. During the Japanese takeover, approximately 200,000 to 300,000 people were killed, and tens of thousands of women were sexually assaulted. These are big numbers, so vast that our brains might not be able to fully comprehend the gravity of it. So let's try another perspective. This will get graphic, so feel free to skip ahead to this time if you'd like. Iris Chang, author of a best-selling book on the Nanjing Massacre, writes, "One historian estimated that if the dead from Nanjing were to link hands, they would stretch from Nanjing to the city of Hangzhou, spanning a distance of some 200 miles. Their bodies would fill 2,500 railroad cars. Stacked on top of each other, these bodies would reach the height of a 74-story building." Such destruction and death was carried out in an unbelievably short amount of time. Within only 3 weeks, Nanjing went from one of China's greatest literary, artistic, and political centers to a city ravaged, its people brutally murdered, viewed by the Japanese military as pigs for slaughter. Women were sexually assaulted. No woman was considered too old, and of course, none too young. W.H. Auden wrote in his poem, In Time of War, "And maps can really point to places where life is evil now. Nanjing, Dachau." To really understand the evil that occurred, we must take a closer look at the Nanjing Massacre. What exactly happened during the 3 darkest weeks in Nanjing's history, and why, despite such horror, did it not ignite the fury of the world? We all rightfully mourn and remember the Holocaust, but very few know of Nanjing. And finally, what is China planning? Because this year, they're determined to shake things up. The first part, focused on the Nanjing Massacre, will be the hardest part to listen to. There will be no graphic images, but if you can handle the descriptions, I strongly recommend sticking through. If not, I'll give a timestamp later to skip ahead to when the explicit sections start. Let's talk about what happened to the people of Nanjing and what Japanese soldiers told themselves as they slaughtered a city.
Slice and dice. Do not make me regret choosing you for this mission.
Nanjing was the capital of nationalist China, and the Japanese intended to crush it. When the Japanese army reached the city after conquering Shanghai, they faced almost no resistance. Most of the defending soldiers were barely trained and sent to prison, thrilled by promises of fair treatment. Then they were separated into groups of 100 or 2, led away, and shot. With the soldiers executed, nothing stood between the Japanese invaders and the people of Nanjing. The city was now at the mercy of an army that would show now. If you're uncomfortable with accounts of torture or rape, please skip ahead to this timestamp as we discuss how ordinary people, Japanese soldiers, can commit such heinous acts. To kill 200,000 people in 3 weeks is almost unimaginable. One Japanese war reporter wrote, "Blood splattered everywhere. The chilling atmosphere made one's hair stand on end and limbs tremble with fear. I stood there at a total loss and did not know what to do." In district after district, men judged of military age were rounded up in batches, marched to the riverbanks or vacant lots, and machine-gunned in rows. The wounded were finished with bayonets, and the bodies were burned or pushed into the Yangtze River to hasten disposal. For days, elders told their children the Yangtze River ran red. In the midst of this slaughter, killing was sometimes turned into a contest. Japanese newspapers reported competitions to see who could kill 100 Chinese first. One such contest ended with a score of 106 to 105. These were human lives, yet they were reduced to nothing more than tally marks on a scoreboard. And death did not always come swiftly. Some accounts describe victims being tortured, set on fire, or buried up to their waists and then torn apart by dogs. Survival also did not mean safety. For many, especially women, it meant entering a different kind of hell. One Japanese soldier recalled, "Women suffered most. No matter how young or old, they all could not escape the fate of being sexually assaulted." Women's suffering was devastating and deeply humiliating. Former Japanese soldier Azuma Shiro described how soldiers perpetrated these acts. "At first, we used words like pi kankan. Pi means hip. Kankan means look. Pi kankan means let's see a woman open up her legs. After a while, we'd say, it's my day to take a bath, and take turns sexually assaulting. Crimes like these happened everywhere and at all hours. Chinese women were not seen as human. Azuma says, perhaps when we were sexually assaulting her, we looked at her as a woman, but when we killed her, we just thought of her as something like a pig. I also want to note that not all victims were women. Chinese men were also sexually assaulted and forced into humiliating acts by laughing Japanese soldiers. There are many such accounts of cruelty. I don't intend to dwell on these horrors, but it's important to comprehend the depth of suffering during this time. One Japanese soldier, Nakatomi, confessed, "You know that soldiers impaled babies on bayonets and tossed them still alive into pots of boiling water. They gaped women from the ages of 12 to 80 and then killed them when they could no longer satisfy sexual requirements. I beheaded people, starved them to death, burned them, and buried them alive. Over 200 in all. It is terrible that I could turn into an animal and do these things. There are really no words to explain what I was doing. I was truly a devil." This was a time of war, but such cruelty was hard to reconcile with modern perceptions of Japanese culture, so often seen as polite and respectful. Which raises the question, does war bring out the worst in people as it did in Nanjing? And what factors could make that happen? There are three things worth exploring here when it comes to the Japanese: Bushido, the way of the samurai, and its influence on Japanese men, the indoctrination of troops from an early age, and the Japanese military environment during the war. Let's start with Bushido.
But can you
The
repeat
samurai
your
class in
success?
Japan first emerged during the Heian period. Samurais followed Bushido, their way of the warrior. Honor, loyalty, and self-sacrifice were central values. For the samurai, the greatest honor was to die serving their lord. If they failed, they'd commit ritual suicide, harakiri, by painfully disemboweling themselves in front of witnesses. Why is Bushido relevant? At first, Bushido values were only shared among the samurai, but when the Kamakura shogunate came to power in the 12th century, the samurai started taking up leadership roles, and Bushido values began spreading through the government and society. Over time, Bushido wasn't just for warriors anymore. It became a moral guide for all young men across Japan. We can see the influence of Bushido in the World War II surrender rates. The Allies surrendered at a rate of 1 per 3 dead, Japanese soldiers at 1 per 120, or considered the kamikaze pilots who willingly sacrificed themselves for the emperor. These values, coupled with a strict military hierarchy, then became twisted and weaponized in Nanjing through what scholar Tanaka Yuki calls the transfer of oppression. Superiors in the Japanese military often subjected their soldiers to intense humiliation, abuse, and punishments. This was not just done if soldiers made mistakes, but often used as a routine part of training, beating soldiers until they bled and making them take part in degrading tasks like washing the underwear of their superiors was thought to instill loyalty in them and to toughen them up. This brutal environment may have contributed to their increased cruelty. Powerless to resist in the military, soldiers may have internalized their resentment and fear. Then, when given power over defenseless civilians, they unleashed cruelty by repeating the same oppressive dynamics they had endured. Japanese troops were also indoctrinated to believe Chinese lives were worthless. It started young. One historian recounts how a Japanese schoolboy burst into tears when told to dissect a frog, and in response his teacher yelled, "Why are you crying about one lousy frog? When you grow up you'll have to kill 100, 200.
Far from over.
When they grew old enough to be on the battlefield, new soldiers still often hesitated in order to kill. One private records none of the recruits volunteering to make the first kill when commanded by their superior. The superior then lost his temper, called them cowards, and said, "Not one of you is fit to call yourself a Japanese soldier." The superior told them that Chinese people must not be seen as human. Their lives were beneath a cat or a dog. Then he would call out names, and recruits would have no choice but to kill the Chinese at their feet. In addition to the constant decriminalization of Chinese people, something else to consider is the way Japanese soldiers viewed their own lives. As Mashiro recalls the saying, "Loyalty is heavier than a mountain, and our life is lighter than a feather." greatest honor a Japanese soldier could achieve during war was to come back dead. This emphasis on loyalty and duty to the emperor reduced individual Japanese soldiers to a constant assistance. If their own lives held no meaning, why should they care or value the lives of the enemy? When you add it all up, Bushido, harsh internal discipline, indoctrination, and a disregard for one's own life, each of these factors played a part in the city's massacre. Now, I want to turn our attention to anything else, or rather, the lack of it. Why do so few people know about the 19 massacre? The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where hundreds of thousands of civilians died, are widely discussed, as they should be. These large-scale wartime atrocities remain ever-present reminders of the horrors of war. But the massacre in 19 is almost never mentioned. And the reason for this is not so straightforward, because you see, after World War II, Japan wanted to keep quiet about the massacre. That's expected, but China was supposed to know about it. Before examining the secrecy around this issue, I wanted to bring up the lack of secrecy or privacy around another important matter, and that is our email. Because did you know, major email providers like Gmail actually can see all our data. We tend to think of emails as sealed letters that only us and the recipient can read. But really, major email providers like Gmail can access all this content. So our emails are less like a sealed letter and more like a postcard. I never knew how exposed my email data was, and honestly, it was unsettling. If this is also making you uncomfortable too, the good news is there is a solution. Proton Mail is the world's leading private email service based in Switzerland and is trusted by journalists, political activists, security experts, and over 100 million people worldwide. And sure, maybe you're not a journalist sending breaking news to your editor, but your emails still deserve confidentiality. Why should providers be allowed to scan through your private information just to sell that data to advertisers? Proton Mail was built on the belief that privacy is a human right, standing apart from big tech companies that profit off your data. With so many services using and selling our information, this founding value really stood out to me. With Proton Mail, only you can access your emails. There's no ads, no trackers, and best of all, it's free. Switching over is seamless. And honestly, why would you not switch? If you care about privacy and you don't want your data to be exploited, make the move to Proton Mail today. It's totally free. Use my link in the description below. Thank you Proton Mail for sponsoring this video, and now back to exploring why this event was kept secret. You've probably heard of the saying, history is written by the victors, but sometimes history isn't written down at all. The Nancy massacre was almost forgotten until one woman decided she could not let the world forget. The biggest thing that prevented the Nancy massacre from getting the attention it deserved is politics. And like all topics involving politics, this gets messy. Let's take a look at Japan first. Japan feeling damage to its reputation and international relations downplays and at times outright denies the massacre even happened, which is crazy. Unlike Germany, where admitting the Holocaust is illegal for history teachers, in Japan, textbooks often minimize or straight up remove references to Nanjing, and when the Nanjing massacre is brought up in Japan, it's often referred to as the Nanjing incident. Textbook censorship means many Japanese may never have learned about these events in school, and when war veterans like Azuma Shiro speak out about their time in Nanjing, they receive death threats. Azuma publicly apologized for his actions during the Nanjing massacre, and afterwards he was forced to move to a tiny village outside Kyoto with his wife for safety. As for the government, well, there are several instances where the government had denied a massacre ever occurring. In 1990, politician Ishihara Shintaro stated, "People say that the Japanese made up Holocaust in Nanjing, but that is not true. It is a story made up by the Chinese. That's tarnished the image of Japan, but it is a lie." Unfortunately, such dismissals of the event continue even today. Just earlier this year, in July, a member of the far-right Sunset Door Party outright denied the existence of the Nanjing massacre.
違います。中国側がどんどんテロ工作をしてくるから、エージェントとしてそういうのを行くわけですよ。だからその中で起きたのが満州じゃないや、南京のね、侵攻とか、でそこで大決戦とかということを、大決戦の時に、満州がこう聞いたらいいんですよ。でも、評価するとそんなんですよ。
There are multiple historical records of the massacre, testimonies from Chinese victims, even Japan's own war veterans. To continue to dismiss the massacre in the modern day and age baffles me. Thankfully, efforts to raise awareness about war atrocities like the Nanjing Massacre and Unit 731, the Human Experimentation Unit, have occurred in Japan. Often done through local exhibitions, visitors are invited to share their thoughts after attending. I want to share with you what one Japanese schoolboy wrote in the 1990s after seeing one such exhibition. From the time I was in elementary school, I'd heard stories from people who experienced bombing raids during the Pacific War. But even though we hear from various sources about our being victims of war, there is almost no talk about Japan's being an assailant. It is important to tell the story from both sides, especially to us in the generation that does not know war. The words of those who did experience it are most valuable. That is why it would be good to increase the places where these words could be heard. Dismissal of these events often comes from the government, and consequently ignorance persists among the public. However, this young boy's words demonstrate a desire to learn and confront the truth. Taking accountability is not what harms your reputation. Constant denial is. This explains in part Japan's silence on the massacre. But what about the side of the victim? Why did China not speak out? Again, the answer is politics. Immediately after Japan's surrender, China was grappling with its own internal conflicts, a civil war between the nationalists and the communists. Political instability during this time overshadowed the Nanjing Massacre. Later, when China's political landscape stabilized, a different set of priorities came into play. In 1972, China and Japan normalized trade relations, and China formally dropped its claims to World War II reparations from Japan. This was both a moral and pragmatic choice. On the moral front, Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai repeatedly emphasized that this was both a gesture of goodwill between the Chinese and the Japanese, and because no amount of money could pay off the suffering that had occurred during the war. On the pragmatic front, this decision helped China and Japan develop a closer trade relationship. Japan had become one of China's most important economic lifelines in the 1970s and 80s. Increasing the flow of trade, economic aid, loans, technology, and information between the two countries played a crucial role in developing China's economy. And if the political agendas from Japan and China weren't enough, US policy also played a part in burying the Nanjing Massacre. To keep this brief, after World War II, because of the Cold War, the US wanted to contain communism and needed Japan as a capitalist ally in Asia. So Japan didn't face the same pressure for owning up to their war crimes as Germany did. This leniency allowed Japan to avoid full responsibility then, and to some degree even now. So yeah, because of politics, memories of the massacre slowly faded, until one woman refused to let it be forgotten. That woman was Iris Chang. It's hard to talk about the Nanjing Massacre without mentioning her name, because her book sold 500,000 copies and had her dubbed the best young historian of her time and put the event back into the public spotlight. Chang's book weaved together numerous first-hand accounts and testimonies, and her work opened the world's eyes to a chapter of history that had almost been forgotten. Chang was invited to the White House by Hillary Clinton and featured on US talk shows like Good Morning America and Nightline to give talks about the massacre. Chang had written in her book after going to a conference on Nanjing and witnessing the depth of its horror, being panicked that the event would be reduced to a footnote in history unless someone forced the world to remember. Chang was not born in China. She was Chinese American, but she had heard of the massacre since childhood, with her parents telling her stories about the event. Neither of my parents witnessed it, but as young children they had heard the stories, and these were passed down to me. The Japanese, I learned, sliced babies not just in half, but in thirds and fourths, they said. The Yangtze River ran red with blood for days. Her parents' stories sowed the seeds for her work on the Nanjing Massacre. This first encounter was also heavily covered by Chinese media, as news reports highlighted the power of memories to connect generations across time, even across different countries and cultures. Chang's unique identity as Chinese American allowed her to bridge not only a gap between China and the rest of the world, but to also form a link between mainland Chinese and the Chinese diaspora. Chang's work cemented the Nanjing Massacre as a major international trauma, and in 2004, she was in the middle of working on another book about the Bataan Death March when she tragically ended her life. Her statue now stands at the entrance of the Nanjing Massacre Memorial Hall in China, and every visitor who goes in to pay their respects has to pass by her first. Chang's book sparked a wave of media attention around the Nanjing Massacre, but perhaps what we're seeing now is the largest movement yet. This year, China is releasing two major blockbuster films set during World War II. One on the Nanjing Massacre, another on Unit 731, the infamous Japanese Japanese humor represent human experiments in China's prisoners. Both movies center on Japanese war atrocities and the theme of China's national suffering. But why are these two films being released now? And what does that reveal about China's current strategy? The release of 731 and Dead to Rights, covering some of the darkest parts of China's experiences in the war, is no coincidence. There are three big reasons. One, this year is a special year. It marks the 80th anniversary of World War II ending. Two, geopolitical tensions are escalating. And three, this is the throwback for the OGs. Film is a form of soft power. First, the 80th anniversary. It's a landmark milestone since World War II. And it's interesting because East Asian countries all tend to remember this time differently. For China, it means victory over Japan. For Korea, it's liberation from Japanese oppression. And for Japan, it's honoring the victims in Hiroshima and Nagasaki from the atomic bombing. These divergent perspectives of the war are, according to Stanford sociologist Shin Ki-wook, at the root of the many underlying political tensions between China, Korea, and Japan. And these tensions are only going to rise as this date gets closer. China sees the 80th anniversary as a day to remember past suffering and triumph, and a time to strengthen national identity. A series of campaigns are planned to emphasize patriotism and encourage historical reflection, with this all culminating in a grand military parade. Geopolitically, increasing tensions with the US, Japan, and Taiwan make it vital for China's leadership to shore up public support. That means preparing the nation for tougher foreign policy stances, like a greater willingness to use military force for threats, implementing economic sanctions, trade restrictions, or embargoes. Releasing World War II themed films reinforces patriotism, unity, and a readiness to defend China's interests if challenged. Through film, China can rally the public, push its narrative internationally, and remind citizens of past foreign aggression. The stories these films tell and the emotions they evoke help build a shared identity and actively shape collective memory. If you remember earlier, one of the Japanese soldiers, Osmo, described the term pikanka, used among soldiers during acts of sexual assault. When I came across that term during my research, I suddenly flashed back to a scene from a Chinese wartime drama I'd watched as a kid, where a Japanese soldier gleefully descended upon a helpless woman, repeating pikankan, pikankan. This isn't a real memory, of course, but seeing the word pikankan triggered that thought and the feeling of fear. In ways like this, media is a powerful tool in shaping our collective memory. Films like these also have soft power value abroad. For non-Chinese, they may be the first exposure to events like the Nanjing Massacre or Unit 731's horrors. Imagine witnessing such atrocities, feeling relieved that the movie is over, and then seeing the words based on true events. With these films, China is able to plant an awareness of the historical trauma to foreigners, and perhaps also foster an understanding in them when it comes to China's current perspective. Films are a potent form of government messaging, used by all countries, not just China. But for China's younger generation who are not affected or remember World War II in the same way older generations do, pop culture retellings are often the most effective way in passing on memories of such events. Think about Chang, who grew up all the way on the other side of the world in a different culture, and the impact she still made because she was moved by the stories her parents shared. That curiosity changed the way the world remembered. As for me, I actually only thought of doing this video because my grandparents were super keen on watching Dead to Rights, a movie about the Nanjing Massacre. My family is actually from Nanjing, so I know the movie would mean a lot to them. And of course, this topic also means a lot to me as well. In Chang's book, she came to the conclusion that Japan's behavior during World War II was less a product of dangerous people than of a dangerous government, in a vulnerable culture, in dangerous times, able to send dangerous rationalizations to those whose human instincts told them otherwise. And I agree. I want to make it clear that this video is not about promoting hate. I wanted to break down the event, confront the cruelty that occurred, and still find empathy in understanding how things escalated so far. In the first part of this video, we learned about what happened in Nanjing and how Japanese ethical codes like Bushido, harsh military environments, and indoctrination allowed for brutality to fester and to be carried out. In the second part, we explored why the massacre went unnoticed, examining the motives of Japan, China, and to some degree the US. And in the last part, we see China reviving and shaping memories with blockbuster films, symbolizing both historical trauma and rising tensions today. The Nanjing Massacre is an undeniable part of history, and though it is confronting to remember, we should not forget. As Nobel laureate Elie Wiesel warned, to forget a Holocaust is to kill twice. If you found this video informative, please subscribe. guide. It's free and I cover all sorts of topics and it's super cool. Thank you for watching and also a big thank you to my wonderful patrons for all their support. I'll see you in the next video. Bye!
These are the 7 most powerful men in China. They represent the top leadership positions of the ruling party, and their identities are revealed every 5 years at a carefully choreographed political event called the National Congress.
China's Communist Party unveils its new leadership over the next 5 years.
The order of appearance is symbolic. The first person to emerge is the head of the party for the next 5 years. At the most recent event in October 2022, that person was Xi Jinping, China's president for the last 10 years, who walked out in the top spot a historic 3rd time after getting rid of China's presidential term limit that restricted all his predecessors to 2 terms. A signal that he may be planning to stay in power for life. The world hasn't seen a Chinese leader like this since Mao Zedong, the revolutionary founder of the People's Republic of China, whose ruthless dictatorship scarred the Chinese people for generations. Xi has been compared to Mao a lot, and he clearly draws from Mao's playbook. But there's something else that connects these two. When Xi was just a young boy, Mao ruined his life. Generations apart, their paths crossed unexpectedly, and a teenage Xi from an elite family in Beijing ended up in exile, condemned to hard labor in the countryside. 50 years later, Xi is one of the most powerful political figures in the world and the only leader since Mao to have unchecked power over China. So, how did he go from being banished in his country to taking complete control of it? Xi Jinping's connection to Mao formed long before Xi was even born. It goes back to when a bloody civil war was raging in China. A group of radical communist revolutionaries, including Mao, gained influence over large swaths of mainland China and controlled a communist military called the Red Army that fought the Nationalist Party ruling the Republic of China at the time. At this point, the communists were losing bad. The bulk of their army was pinned down here, in a communist-controlled region originally established by Mao, now surrounded by nationalist forces. And they were running low on food. So the Red Army decided to launch a bold attack to break through the nationalist forces and evacuate the roughly 130,000 communist soldiers and civilians stuck here. On October 16, 1934, they made their move and attacked a weaker part of the enemy line. They broke through, and even though their numbers quickly dropped, with thousands dying and thousands more fleeing to the countryside, around 86,000 stuck together and pushed on. This was the beginning of a year-long historic retreat called the Long March, a journey to establish a new communist base far from the nationalist forces. Mao, who used to be a military leader, wasn't in charge at this time. He'd insisted on using guerrilla tactics, which had heavily influenced the Red Army earlier in the war, but that approach had fallen out of favor and he was demoted. The Long March changed that. After escaping the siege here, the Red Army continued to suffer relentless attacks by the pursuing Nationalist Army. The military leaders of the march had pushed for a more traditional wartime strategy of direct confrontation rather than Mao's guerrilla tactics. And the result was catastrophic for the Red Army. Less than half of the original escape group survived in the first 3 months alone. So it was at this first stopping point where Communist Party leader Zhou Enlai handed military leadership back to Mao. And Mao picked an endpoint for the march, here, 800 miles away in rural northern China. But they didn't go straight for it. Mao led the Red Army deep into the mountains, where he predicted lighter resistance. And he was right. But the journey was still brutal. It was 9 more months of non-stop marching and fighting along this several thousand-mile route before they ultimately arrived in northern China, where a guerrilla base led by a communist revolutionary named Xi Zhongshun offered Mao's army refuge, bringing the Long March to an end. That man was Xi Jinping's father. In the end, fewer than 8,000 of the original marchers survived. Even though thousands died on the Long March from starvation, fighting, and disease, Mao's leadership was credited with saving the Red Army from total annihilation, and he became the de facto head of the party as well as the military, entrusted with rebuilding the army to take on the nationalist forces for total control of China.
Wherever and however the red troops move into battle, they spread the glory of Mao Zedong.
This is a good stopping point in the story to talk about how power in the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, works. Officially, the highest level of authority is a group called the Central Committee, and is responsible for all of the party's major policy decisions. Within the Central Committee is a select group of officials called the Political Bureau, or Politburo. In most communist parties, like that of the former Soviet Union, the Politburo represents the most powerful members of the party besides the General Secretary. But the Chinese Communist Party has a key distinction that makes it unique. It has one more, even smaller selection of top officials who ultimately have the final say, an elite class of Politburo members called the Politburo Standing Committee. This group, which includes the General Secretary, holds supreme control over the Central Committee, dictates the will of the party, and is in full control of the Central Military Commission, which oversees Chinese defense. Mao's promotion during the Long March landed him here, in the highest position of the military and the Politburo Standing Committee. Even though he was considered the de facto head of the party when the Long March ended in 1935, he officially became head of the party in 1943. With both the party and the military under his control, Mao began to exploit the system to ensure he remained at the top for the rest of his life. At Mao's first National Congress as the official party leader in 1945, the party introduced a resolution that brought his influence to a whole new level. It unified the party around a single understanding of its history and declared Mao's political ideology, later called Mao Zedong thought, or Maoism, as the unquestioned guiding principle of the Chinese Communist Party. Basically, Mao's ideas or policy decisions could no longer be challenged by anyone. It was here he unveiled his equivalent at the time of the Politburo Standing Committee, the four other top party leaders, all long marchers deeply loyal to Mao, like Liu Shaoqi and Zhou Enlai, who would go on to hold some of the most powerful positions in the future government. 4 years later, Mao declared final victory for the communists in the decades-long Chinese Civil War and established a new country, the People's Republic of China, the PRC.
Mao Zedong, once a lowly party worker, now assumed the stature of the dominant figure in all of Eastern Asia.
But winning a revolution isn't the same as running a country.
Because now that you're running a country, there's all these other things you have to do, like deliver the mail and like build a dam and stuff like that. You can't possibly have the party do all these things.
So the party set up a government that would take the policy decisions made by the Politburo Standing Committee and figure out a way to make them a reality.
And so it evolved to a system where the party would make all the important decisions, and especially the Politburo Standing Committee. Then, as it is today, many of these decisions would go to the State Council. So the State Council is the highest decision-making body on the state side, led by the Premier of China.
The Premier of China, by the way, is almost always a member of the Politburo Standing Committee. One way Mao kept a tight grip on power over the years was by promoting those loyal to him to top positions in the party and government, whether they had government experience or not. For example, Zhou Enlai, the former party leader who helped Mao rise to power during the Long March, became China's first premier.
The advantage of that is that they could never challenge it. The disadvantage of that is they didn't know what they were doing, and so administration suffered, policy outcomes suffered.
Long March survivors often became party elites under Mao. Xi Jinping's father, for example, was appointed Secretary General of the State Council. And as the son of a Long Marcher, young Xi was given the informal title of Prince. Mao succeeded in never giving up his power during his lifetime. His unchecked policies resulted in massive famines and widespread persecution that cost between 40 and 80 million lives over a span of decades, and culminated in the disastrous Cultural Revolution, a violent final attempt from Mao to consolidate his power and force loyalty to the practice of Maoism. The idea was to make himself and his ideas eternal, the way he viewed communist figureheads like Lenin and Marx before him. Anyone that didn't fall in line with Mao's ideology was publicly humiliated, impoverished, excluded from society, and in many cases, executed, either at the hands of the army or by a militant youth group obsessed with enforcing Maoism, the Red Guard. Even those closest to the dictator weren't safe from his purges during the Cultural Revolution. High-level officials, including members of the Politburo Standing Committee and Long Marchers, were removed from their positions. Liu Shaoqi was denounced as a traitor and died while imprisoned under harsh conditions. Mao also removed the chief of staff of the army and replaced him with a Maoist, leaving no one left to oppose him in the military. Mao's handpicked successor, who always appeared loyally by his side in photos and propaganda posters, died under mysterious circumstances when his plane crashed as he was fleeing to the Soviet Union. Mao later denounced him as a traitor. He denounced Xi's father, too. This is a photo of Xi Sr. being restrained and publicly criticized by the Red Guards at the height of the Cultural Revolution. He would remain a prisoner in Beijing for 8 years following that. With his father purged, Xi Jinping, 15 at the time, was expelled from his elite school in Beijing and sent to work in the countryside.
He had to live in a cave and, do hard manual labor. His food was barely enough for, a growing young person. And Chairman Mao was responsible for all of it.
But then, Mao died. The Cultural Revolution ended. His successor was Deng Xiaoping, one of the Politburo Standing Committee members who was removed from power during the Cultural Revolution, who, just before Mao died, started making a promise to fellow exiled party veterans.
Deng Xiaoping signaled credibly to all the surviving Long Marchers that he wanted to rehabilitate people. So when Mao died, they all supported the rehabilitation of Deng. And as soon as Deng was rehabilitated, he went ahead and rehabilitated all these people.
With experienced leadership back in place, the party needed to figure out how to prevent something like this from ever happening again. In order to undo Mao's cult of personality, the party introduced a second historical resolution in 1981. It condemned periods of Mao's rule and emphasized a renewed commitment to collective leadership, vowing to oppose the consolidation of power around one person moving forward.
The successors to Mao didn't want a dictatorship, so they divided up these positions and put them in the hands of different people.
Like Mao, Deng kept tight control over the Central Military Commission as its chairman, and held a leadership position in the government, but was never head of state. He never held the highest position in the party either. Instead, he set up a new advisory commission and served as its chairman, which allowed him to influence the party's direction without positioning himself directly on top of it. This allowed a power-sharing structure while still making Deng the de facto leader of China until he stepped down in 1989, following the army's massacre of students protesting in Tiananmen Square.
A protester suddenly ran into the middle of the street and in front of the oncoming tanks.
Anger at Deng Xiaoping, the entire Chinese government, it had the real feeling of rebellion in the streets of Beijing. People want to fight the military out of their city.
Deng and his ideology, which moved away from Maoism, set a precedent of Chinese power. He opened up China and established economic ties with these countries, and was the first PRC leader to visit the U.S. in 1979.
Today we take another step in the historic normalization of relations which we have begun this year.
Deng's reforms became the foundation for decades of economic prosperity that led China to having the world's second largest economy over time and being on the verge of becoming the world's next superpower.
Communism is creating a consumer society.
I also remind you that the standard of living in China is going up. Here, capitalism rules.
One thing power sharing did lead to was a lot of policy innovation and then some degree of decentralization, and both of these things helped China's economy enormously.
Which is why this period of economic growth and reform, stretching over roughly 30 years, is known as the Deng era. And whether he wanted to or not, Deng kept his word and never tried to consolidate absolute power around himself.
He did end up sharing power. And that set the stage for power sharing in the party until the rise of Xi Jinping.
So what was Xi doing all this time? When Mao died in 1976, Xi was back in Beijing studying communist philosophy. Even though the Chinese Communist Party had ruined Xi's family, he had joined it, just as the Cultural Revolution was winding down.
Personally, he might begrudge Chairman Mao for doing all these terrible things to his family, but I think at this time he also recognized that in the system of the Chinese Communist Party, power is everything. Without power, you're nothing.
But in order to get that power, Xi did something unexpected. He left Beijing.
As his competitors were fiercely competing with each other in the 1980s and 1990s, he sort of got out of their way and went to the provinces.
He took positions in party leadership in rural, poor provinces all around China, where there were no other princelings to compete with. First in Hebei, a poor rural province outside of Beijing, where he easily reached the top spot as party secretary. Then in Fujian, a heavily militarized region where top members of the army were stationed. He moved up the ranks of party secretary here too, before becoming the governor of the province a few years later. After making powerful friends in the military, Xi went here, where he once again assumed the office of party secretary and grew his support on the civilian side. This strategy of moving around didn't just give Xi a leg up in areas where competition was slim, it also gave him credibility as a humble, hardworking party leader, and he cultivated a growing group of supporters who would come back into play years down the line. It was his last stop, and his shortest one, that ultimately got him back to Beijing. A brief stint in the top party spot in Shanghai in 2007, where he rehabilitated the city's image following a high-level corruption scandal. Xi developed a reputation here as a prudent leader who toed the party line. Just 7 months later, he finally returned to Beijing, having been promoted to the all-powerful Politburo Standing Committee.
Basically, the people who were deciding on top leadership at the time, they wanted a princeling, but they didn't want a princeling who was too ambitious or too strong. So Xi Jinping, he was seen as less ambitious because he was willing to go to the countryside and work in lower level positions.
When Xi emerged at the 2007 National Congress and leadership unveiling, he was one of the 9 most powerful men in the future. It was at this moment that his strategic climb over 17 long years in the countryside paid off, big time. When the General Secretary stepped down in 2012, Xi emerged at the top spot in the party as China's leader. Now, the elite son of a former revolutionary, turned exiled peasant, turned party darling, was poised to seize control of everything.
This is the place to watch.
Like Mao, Xi Jinping believes that rallying around a single figure is crucial to the party's survival, rather than the collective leadership guns and forks in one man. So, pretty much as soon as Xi Jinping came to power, he started getting rid of people.
The news 4 top officials removed for taking bribes was announced on state TV.
Xi Jinping has just sacked his foreign minister, just sacked his defense minister, he sacked a whole lot of other people at the top of the military establishment.
The former security czar has not been seen in public for more than a year. The investigation against Xu allows the Chinese president to remove those opposed to his reforms.
He launched a major anti-corruption campaign as soon as he took power in late 2012, early 13, which led to the arrest of hundreds of senior level officials as well as military officers.
These purges targeted Xi's rivals in the party, whose vacant positions he filled with his own supporters.
After this massive purge, Xi Jinping was in very tight control over both the party and also the Chinese military, thereby making him the most powerful leader of the Chinese Communist Party since the death of Mao.
That pattern continued in the second term, where he unveiled 5 new faces of the Politburo Standing Committee, 3 of them with close personal ties to Xi. In 2021, Xi pulled off one of his most dramatic acts yet to enforce his influence over the Chinese Communist Party. He introduced a 3rd historic resolution that unified the party's ideology around one clear line of thinking: Xi Jinping thought. Xi's personal political ideology would now be the core in the party's thinking, political stance, and action. Basically, Xi Jinping's ideas could no longer be challenged. And they weren't for many years. During Xi's first 10 years in power, the size of China's economy more than doubled. So did average individual income. So did military spending. Under his leadership, China's presence on the world stage has grown too, positioning the rising superpower to take on the role of an aggressor externally, reasserting claims over parts of the South China Sea, intimidating Taiwan and Tibet, and stripping democratic process in Hong Kong. Inside its own borders, strict internet censorship and surveillance are widespread. And oppression of Uyghurs, a mostly minority Muslim ethnic group, is marked by human rights abuses. But it wasn't until COVID that Xi saw the first real challenge to his authority.
Anger in China is growing.
Video showing protesters in Xinjiang fed up with China's zero COVID rules.
The boldest public challenge yet for leader Xi Jinping.
With these protests all around the country and the party's reputation in peril, Xi reversed the failed policy, but is now faced with a shaky economy and cracks in his unchecked authority. It was just weeks before the widespread protests at the 20th National Congress in 2022 that Xi walked out in the leading position a third time. He had already locked in the presidency for another 5 years, and unveiled a Politburo Standing Committee completely packed with those loyal to him, after removing the final senior members of the party that had ties to his predecessor. Now, there is no one left in party or military leadership whose ideology differs from Xi.
I don't think anyone can push him out at this point. I think he will be the most powerful leader in China as long as he's alive and conscious.
Thanks so much for watching this episode of Atlas. So many teammates worked on this piece. The small army of editors, animators, and researchers helped bring this complicated story into focus. I'd especially like to shout out Raja, one of the key researchers on this piece, who conducted an incredible interview with our expert, Vic Issue. It takes a lot of resources to make these videos, but we publish our work free to watch here because we think journalism should be accessible to everyone. If you believe in keeping journalism free and want to support our continuing work, go to vox.com/give now to make a contribution. Thanks again.
Hi, welcome to another episode of Cold Fusion. Only a couple of years ago, China was on the path to overtaking the United States and becoming the world's largest economy. In 2014, many were speculating that this could happen as soon as 2024. Dubbed by many as an economic miracle, China grew from a third world country to a global superpower in just a matter of a few decades. Few could foresee the effects that the economic reform of the late 1970s would have on the developing country. Soon, the lists of the largest companies in the world began to feature more and more Chinese enterprises. Globally, the country was one of the most important trade partners, fueling globalization on a scale never seen before, and with that power came influence. Fast forward a few years, and China finds itself in a myriad of problems, both economic and political. Catastrophic zero-COVID policy, real estate debt crisis, external infrastructure issues, internal debt issues, a mini-revolt of the youth, and the slowing down of the economy are just some of the things that have been plaguing the nation recently. The results of these issues threaten the very power structures of the country. So how did China get here, and what are the consequences for the country and the world as a whole? So get comfortable, buckle up, and get ready for a wild ride.
You are watching Cold Fusion TV.
Let's begin by understanding the most talked about issue, the real estate bubble. The main growth, both for the Chinese economy as well as the housing market, began in 1979 with economic reform. From here, China opened up to the rest of the world. Massive civilian migration from rural locations to main city hubs ensued as people looked to improve their quality of life.
hundreds of millions of sons, and particularly daughters, of Chinese farmers who moved from the farm where they were earning really the same as they were earning 1,000 years ago in Chinese history. Absolute subsistence wages. They traveled 4 or 5 hours to the local city, and there they began working in the big factories, the workshop of the world.
Due to that, in 4 decades, China went from a mostly rural population to a country where 2/3 of the entire population lives in major city hubs. On top of relocations, a cultural element also boosted the sales of housing. Owning real estate was considered a source of financial stability for a family, as well as a prerequisite for marriage.
As a result of the one-child policy and the Chinese preferring male heirs, there are 35 million more men than women in China. That creates intense competition for brides, with men often having to prove their material worth. This often means owning a home.
This led to entire families and their friends pooling money to contribute to the purchase of a house for their relatives. Why, you might ask? Because the prices of apartments have gotten so out of control that according to the Financial Times, housing affordability in China is among the worst in the world. Taking into account living expenses, it would take the average earner 50 years to buy an apartment. This collective pooling of money is a major difference between the Chinese property market and the West. Little inventory and slow development combined with rapid growth led to major supply issues. Thus, prices rose and affordable housing became an issue for local governments. The solution was to issue loans to property development companies, as well as easing the credit lending standards to individuals. Due to these factors, the Chinese real estate market became a rocket ship and it fueled massive economic growth. Some companies, like the infamous Evergrande, took full advantage of the situation and expanded aggressively, aided in a large part by the availability of cheap credit. Evergrande became so large that they even built a theme park and purchased a soccer team with some of the money. The theme park is now abandoned. We'll see why shortly, but here's how it looks like now. It really is a sad waste of money, time, and resources. Many of these property institutions quickly became the largest in the country, and many expanded projects into overseas markets. Commercial housing sales reached $2.7 trillion in 2020. In China today, the general population has about 70% of their total wealth stored in the real estate market. Let me repeat that. 70% of their total wealth is stored in the real estate market. However, the supply of housing is still short, in part due to speculation. It was commonplace to purchase a second or third home as an investment, since it was considered wise and a stable use of savings. Seeing the never-ending demand, developers created an ingenious system to further fuel expansion. These were based on 2 key pillars. First, they started to finance their operations with foreign debt. The appetite for Chinese debt and equity was increasing around the world since their massive growth brought very attractive yields. Secondly, developers created pre-sale options for buyers that quickly became the norm in the country. In it, home buyers would give money to developers for a home that has yet to be built. All they had was a promise that once it was finished, it would be theirs.
The whole construction period will take 2 to 3 years usually, and people will start paying the mortgage way before the completion of the project.
We're talking about months?
Years, even years. Over a year, even a year and a half. In the past, it wasn't seen as risky business, as I said, and people would not expect developers cannot complete their home at a large scale. Not like that.
While this made sense for both sides, it quickly escalated. With loose regulations around how much money the property developers needed to keep, they started to game the system to their advantage. By obtaining pre-sales, they were able to start new projects without finishing the old ones. Once the new projects yielded new pre-sales, they would use some of that money to finance the actual construction, while the rest went to new projects, and so on. In essence, they created a Ponzi scheme that relied 100% on the stable and perpetual growth of the housing market. However, once the influx of people to major cities started to slow down from 4.1% in 1996 to 2.1% in 2020, the scheme started to fall apart. With a slowdown in pre-sales, developers started to rely more and more on banks and foreign debt to keep expanding. Sometimes the debt payment was too large to pay with an operating income, so they used further debt to finance their obligation. It all continued for some time, but soon the Chinese authorities ended the scheme. In August of 2020, the Chinese government implemented the 3 red lines policy. Each line represents a debt ratio that the companies have to respect. If not, their ability to contract more liabilities is severely hampered. Developers with extreme amounts of debt, such as Evergrande, crossed all 3 lines, meaning that they were not able to increase their liabilities any further. And since Evergrande used debt to finance old liabilities, it was not long before they started to run into liquidity trouble. First, they failed to repay the wealth managers, who had a direct investment in the company, and this provoked a large revolt by wealth managers and investors who went to their headquarters to protest.
In September 2021, there was a hugely crucial moment.
Evergrande missed payments on wealth management products. The wealth management market in China is where ordinary people put their savings, and the money is usually going into real estate, often to companies like Evergrande. And these people who had invested haven't got their money back. They descended on the headquarters of Evergrande in Shenzhen.
We don't know where to get our money. And now we go to Shenzhen government and nobody help us.
This was the point at which it went from it might be a crisis to, well, it probably is a crisis.
Soon after, Evergrande started to fail on its payments of dollar bonds, and these bonds were sold to the Western world. And they weren't the only property company in trouble. Property developer Kesa missed a $400 million bond payment in November of 2021. And in January of 2022, Shinmyo Group defaulted on a $101 million loan. And most recently, Yuzo Group requested to defer a payment of offshore bonds worth $582 million. This resulted in a large loss of confidence in the Chinese housing and bond market, both internally and externally. This culminated in mortgage strikes by distinguished buyers who are paying their monthly bills without seeing any progress on their purchased property. Today, more than 320 groups of homeowners are believed to be refusing to pay their mortgage loans.
Anger erupting among Chinese home buyers as property developers hold construction on their homes.
这种希望破灭的那种感觉，就有点万念俱灰了。
Since July, home buyers in over 100